Coming up on Arirang News, North Korea is seen removing the loudspeakers it reinstalled just days ago at the DMZ for the purpose of broadcasting propaganda into the South, apparently on the orders of Kim Jong-un, who's canceled the regime's plans for military action at the border. The World Trade Organization is forecasting that global trade will have declined in the second quarter by 18.5%. Separately, Moody's says it expects the economies of the G20 this year to shrink by more than 4.5%. And South Korea had more deaths than births in April for a sixth straight month. Births were down more than 10% from a year earlier, and in the pandemic, marriages down more than 20%. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. Just 3 days after North Korea started reinstalling propaganda loudspeakers along the border, the regime appears to be removing them again. According to a state media report, Kim Jong-un has canceled what had been announced as military action against South Korea. Our correspondent for North Korean affairs, Myung-hee, has more.
North Korea was observed Wednesday removing around 10 propaganda loudspeakers it had installed at the border near the Peace Observatory in Gangwon-do province. According to a South Korean military source, the North had only started reinstalling the loudspeakers on Sunday, 30 of them in total. The speakers are used to blast out anti-South Korea propaganda. The two Koreas had removed all of their speakers after they agreed through the Panmunjom Declaration in 2018 that they would stop all hostile actions, which included anti-state broadcast and the dropping of propaganda leaflets. The North had started to reinstall them, though, in retaliation for the anti-Pyongyang leaflets being sent over the border from the south by North Korean defectors. Seoul's Unification Ministry says it's closely monitoring and analyzing North Korea's recent movements. It also re-emphasized that the South Korean government is firm that the 2018 Inter-Korean Agreement must be adhered to. The sudden decision by North Korea to remove the loudspeakers was apparently on the orders of leader Kim Jong-un. According to the regime state-run media, in a preliminary meeting of the Central Military Commission on Tuesday, he decided to suspend the military action plans the regime had previously said it would take against South Korea. The North's military had warned last Tuesday what its next steps would be in response to the sending of anti-Pyongyang leaflets. Those steps included positioning troops in the areas around Mount Kumgang and the Kaesong Industrial Complex, restoring guard posts in the demilitarized zone, resuming all kinds of regular military exercises at the border, and sending anti-South Korea leaflets across the DMZ. Myung-hee, Arirang News.
The United States continues to be seriously worried about North Korea's nuclear weapons program. Washington has also reiterated its vow to maintain sanctions on the regime until full denuclearization is achieved. Lee Sung-jae reports.
In its latest annual report on the U.S. and other nations' compliance with various arms control and non-proliferation agreements, the U.S. State Department raises the possibility that North Korea may have additional unidentified nuclear facilities. It adds that Washington continues to have significant concerns about Pyongyang's nuclear weapons program. According to the 79-page document, which was reported to Congress on Tuesday, the U.S. continues to closely monitor North Korea's nuclear activities. It says a final, fully verified denuclearization of North Korea remains the overriding U.S. objective, and it remains committed to continue diplomatic negotiations with the regime toward that goal. The State Department also stated that North Korea did not adhere to its nuclear weapons obligations and commitments under its agreements with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the U.S. government, and other members of the six-party nuclear talks. The department cited IAEA reports on activities detected at the North's main nuclear complex in Yongbyon, which includes the construction of an experimental light water reactor that could be used to produce fissile material for nuclear weapons. Despite the report, the State Department urged North Korea on Tuesday to return to engagement as the regime continues to threaten South Korea over anti-Pyongyang leaflet campaigns. Pyongyang has issued a barrage of threats throughout June, taking issue with Seoul's failure to stop defectors and activists sending leaflets over the border. Speaking to Seoul-based Yonhap News Agency, A State Department spokesperson also reaffirmed that Washington remains in close coordination with South Korea over the matter. 이승재, Arirang News.
The World Trade Organization says global trade is expected to have declined by 18.5% on year in the second quarter. In a separate report, Moody's is forecasting that the G20 economies will contract by 4.6% this year. Kim Hyo-sun reports.
The WTO expects global trade to drop by a whopping 18.5% in the second quarter compared to the same period last year. In a report released Tuesday, the global trade watchdog explained that the plunge is largely due to the COVID-19 pandemic and associated lockdown measures that have affected a large share of the global population. However, it also added the expected plunge was better than the agency's worst-case scenario, saying the global economy may have bottomed out in the second quarter. Amid the prolonged pandemic, Moody's Investor Service has trimmed its 2020 growth outlook for the world's major 20 economies. It forecasts G20 economies to contract by 4.6% this year, which is a decline of 0.6 percentage points from its earlier forecast in April. It has slashed the growth outlook for major European countries, which were hit the hardest by the pandemic. Moody's forecasts COVID-19 to hurt Britain's economy, slashing its forecast to minus 10.1% from its earlier forecast of minus 7%. It also cut its forecast for France to minus 10.1% from minus 6.3%. As for emerging countries, Moody's cut Brazil's forecast by 1%. It maintains South Korea's growth forecast at minus 0.5%, while it estimates China's economy to grow by 1%. In a bid to resolve the economic fallout of the pandemic, EU leaders are scheduled to hold an in-person summit on July 17th. The 27 national leaders are expected to discuss an $846 billion emergency fund suggested by its executive body. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
South Korea is moving to stay ahead of any further export curbs imposed by Japan, like the ones Tokyo put last year on key materials for making computer chips. It'll do so by accelerating the development of South Korea's own parts and equipment sector. Meeting with government officials Wednesday, the ruling Democratic Party said it will revise related policies to make that happen. The party said parts and materials are vital for future businesses and for the government's New Deal initiative aimed at building an economy that's based on data. It discussed enhancing private-public sector cooperation, expanding R&D, and stabilizing supply networks. This comes after Tokyo warned of more restrictions as their dispute rumbles on at the World Trade Organization. South Korea's Trade Minister Myung-hee says she's running for the top job at the WTO. At a press conference this morning, Yoo said she would be applying for the Director General post in the coming hours. She vowed to upgrade the agency's agreements and reestablish the WTO's position of resisting global protectionism. She's a renowned trade negotiator with 25 years of experience and is the third South Korean to run. The WTO has so far received 4 other applications from Egypt, Mexico, Nigeria, and Moldova. Registration closes July 8th. During the consultation process, the General Counsel will narrow the field of candidates until they reach a consensus around a single candidate. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Yang Jun-seok, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, thank you for making time today.
Happy to be here.
Well, markets got a boost from Trump administration officials saying that the U.S.-China trade deal is still intact. The U.S. economy also showing some improvement, which sent all 3 main indexes on Wall Street higher. What's the story in the global markets and here in Korea?
Okay, well, as you mentioned, the U.S. market has been rising this week, and much of that is, as you mentioned, due to Peter Navarro, who had commented that the U.S.-China trade deal was over, but he had to take back the comment. So that added significant push to the market, but also there has been a couple of good news in the U.S. economy. The housing sales in May had been better than expected, so a lot of people figure that U.S. is making a comeback. And then the Purchasing Managers Index, which is sort of a forward indicator of how businesses will do in the next month or so. In June, the Purchasing Managers Index went up. which means that the companies are probably going to buy much more than they did in May. That means, at least from the company's point of view, things seem to be optimistic. Now, from the stock market's point of view, there's a lot of question on whether this increase is a long-term trend or it's just a short-term burst due to the end of the shutdown. There's mounting evidence that reopening in the U.S. may have been done too early. Coronavirus is rising in 20 states, and there is also continuing concerns on whether this rise in stock market is a bubble or is it real. And a lot of people are starting to short sell the market. Some analysts believe that this is a indication that a lot of people are starting to believe that the market is in bubble. So there is significant number of other analysts who believe that this is just a normal hedging process. But still, the market, even though it is rising, does seem to be somewhat nervous. So U.S. markets are doing well. European market, last week, like the U.S., it was in sort of a wait-and-see pattern, but it also picked up with the same trend with the U.S. It's rising this week. Hong Kong stock indices has been rising as well, but so strangely enough, Shanghai and Nikkei indices seem to be now in a sort of a holding pattern. They're not rising or falling by very much. Kospi and Kosdaq, they're taking the U.S. trend. They've risen quite significantly this week.
Well, talking about oil prices for a minute, they, of course, had gone negative during the pandemic, but they continue to recover. West Texas crude up to $40 a barrel now, but some saying the sector itself might not be improving so much. Professor, what do you see happening in the third quarter with oil?
Okay, well, you have to remember that oil prices are still significantly down compared to the situation before the coronavirus. There has been an increase in prices lately, and that may be because U.S. is getting out of the lockdown. Though, as I mentioned earlier, there's more and more concern that perhaps the U.S. opened up too early. European Union, China, Japan, they're moving out of the worst of the coronavirus slowdown. They seem to be heading out of the coronavirus in a rather regular fashion, not like the United States. So the global demand for oil seems to be inching back, but it's too early, I think, to be completely optimistic about oil because there's still a large amount of stored oil, unusually large amount that has to be spent first before the prices really starts to rise significantly. There has been an agreement, I think, between the OPEC and other major oil producers, so they're probably going to start making the headway on reducing the stored oil, but still I think it'll take more than third quarter, maybe fourth quarter or early next year for oil prices to really recover to the pre-coronavirus levels.
Now, the pandemic, of course, has caused revenues to plummet in many kinds of small businesses, especially. In fact, a statistic from the Bank of Korea, if this continues, then even if you sold all the financial assets of more than 300,000 households, they wouldn't be able to hold out longer than a year. So for the self-employed in particular, what needs to be done? Okay, well, debt by the self-employed in Korea has always been a problem. If you look at the household debt problem in Korea, the largest component was housing and real estate related loans. But the second largest component, even though it is very much smaller than the real estate component, the second largest component was lending to self-employed. And unlike the housing and real estate loans, the borrowers who are self-employed, they do not necessarily have good credit rating. They do not necessarily have stable income. So even though the proportion is a lot less than real estate related lending, it was more of a risky lending. Now, what can we do right now? I think right now the situation is much too unstable to have the company deal with the problem directly, which is letting some of these companies, smaller companies, perhaps go out of business. But the economy is much too unstable right now. We're going to have to give some aid to these companies, but as soon as the recovery takes place, we may have to see which companies no longer deserve any additional loans. It's a big conundrum to be sure, Professor. Thanks so much for sharing your insights today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
The new data shows South Korea saw more deaths than births in April for the sixth consecutive month. According to Statistics Korea, 23,420 babies were born in April, while deaths were about 1,200 more than that. The number of births in April dropped more than 10% from the same month last year, whereas deaths were up more than 3%. The number of births has been falling on year for 53 months in a row. Meanwhile, the number of marriages was down almost 22% on year, with the COVID-19 outbreak exacerbating the general trend of fewer marriages. And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.